Hey students, I am making this lecture to go in conjunction with the Richard II and Henry background PowerPoint that I've linked both in this video and on your assignment. Forgive me, a little pale and wan here. If you notice there's a slight yellow to me, again, just had the gallbladder out. The liver was unhappy with me, so hence the yellow tinge. So I promise this was not my usual gig during quarantine. All right, while looking at that PowerPoint, I'll indicate to you when to go to the next slide, just so you have me sort of step by step. You'll see on the very first slide that I suggest that you grab a coffee. Caffeine is legal. Have as much of it as you can. On the second slide, I have the three actors who've played these three kings, Richard, Henry IV, and Henry V. The reason that I've used these actors, one, this was the most recent production of the Henriad, which is the name for all four plays. It's done by the BBC. It was only done a few years ago. It was really, really, really good. And also, I think they did an excellent job tapping into some of the most important aspects of the play with their casting. So if you notice, Ben Whishaw plays Richard. He's the one in the middle in the yellow. You've seen him on the most recent 007 movies. He plays Q for them. He's very thin, almost feminine looking. He has longer hair, very thin beard. He looks skinny. He is skinny, shorter than the other actors. You have Jeremy Irons playing grown-up Henry IV, and then you have Tom Hiddleston playing Henry V. Really nothing better than Tom Hiddleston playing Henry V. For slide 3, Ms. Gicky indicated to me that you guys needed a little history, so I'm going to give you some history. So Shakespeare lived during Queen Elizabeth I and King James I's reign. Knowing which ruler he was doing plays under is kind of important. The point of these plays was that they were done during Elizabeth's reign. These are the direct descendants of Elizabeth's royal line. So when you do the history plays and you're under Queen Elizabeth and you're making commentary about kings, you're also making commentary on her. Fun fact, one of my favorite facts, is that Elizabeth was complimented by Henry V. So if you wanted to compliment Elizabeth, you would maybe, when she was at your house, hire people to put on Henry V. If you were being critical of her, you'd put on Richard II. Because as we know, Richard II is about the deposition of an unfit ruler. And one of her favorites, one of her court favorites, that everyone kind of back and forth thought Elizabeth would marry, and he eventually got fed up not marrying her and decided that he was rebelling, he, when hosting her, put on Richard II, and she got pissed. And she actually said to her advisors very angrily, "Know ye not, I am Richard II right now." So she knew what was going on. The Henriad series is about leadership in different ways. So Richard's leadership in contrast to Henry IV's, in contrast to Henry V's. Henry V is one of the most successful British kings of all time. If you look back, funny enough, Britain has very successful queens and not very many successful kings. Like if you draw the line and you're like, who are the most successful rulers in English history, you'll go like Victoria, Elizabeth. You won't be drawing many male names. But Henry V would have been one of those names. He was the only king to successfully conquer France. And the English and the French always hate each other. If you go down to slide 4, one of the reasons we would have put on these plays back then, but also now, is it's educational-ish. So the way that you guys were shown Braveheart or Pearl Harbor, you're learning about an aspect of history, but not exactly 100% accurate. So people in Elizabeth's time would have known that this wasn't exactly 110% correct, but it was close. Some of the interpretations are meant to be engaging. Some of them are meant to be critical. I really like some of the things they did with this particular version of Richard that I use, the BBC Hollow Crown version. So the guy, Ben Whishaw, who was playing him, said the director said, I want you to think about Oscar Wilde and Michael Jackson while you're playing the character. You also would do this for the sense of patriotism. So if you're putting on these plays, especially in Elizabeth's time, it's a sense of patriotism to Elizabeth. Not so much to James. Other plays were put on for James because James's whole line is on the Scottish end of the family. And there's a whole lot more I could go into with the Scottish end of the family. But essentially because Elizabeth dies childless, her line ends and they have to go over to the cousins. She's already killed James's mom as a threat to her throne. So she's putting a young, handsome man on the throne of England when she already killed his mom and just hoping this all goes well. It does, for the most part. Now, in the Henriad, the 4 plays, which are Richard II, Henry IV Part 1, Henry IV Part 2, Henry V. They were not released the same time. So it wasn't like Shakespeare just dropped all 4 of them. They were written and released and dropped in sequential order. And they were written and released in sequential order after their sequel, after the series of plays he wrote that were about the kings after this, Henry VI. People at Shakespeare's time would have known kind of about these kings. The way if I said to you, oh, we're going to watch a movie about Andrew Jackson, you'd be like, I kind of know Andrew Jackson. The way if I said, we're going to watch something about Teddy Roosevelt, you'd be like, I kind of know that name. Not that you know it well, not that you are an expert, not that you could write your own essay or whatever on this, but you know the names and are generally familiar with what they did. Same for Shakespeare's time. They would have been like, oh yeah, Richard II, he was a king, right? Now, in the history, it's close, but there are distinctions made between the history in the play, and they are called his history plays, and the actual history. It's not so bad, but I am now on slide 6, if you're following along. And this is often called the tragedy of Richard II, so sort of blending 2 of the Shakespearean genres, which the Shakespearean genres are comedy, tragedy, and history. And we have something called tragicomedies. Other people call them romances. I don't like this. Romances are only 4 of the plays, and they're tragicomedies. They're basically 4 plays that do not fit the qualifications for either tragedy or comedy. This is sometimes called the tragedy of Richard II because, I don't know about you, but by the end I do feel really bad for Richard, even though I don't like Richard. I like listening to Richard. It's the drama of it. It's very reality show leadership. You love to watch Richard fail. He was called Richard of Bordeaux in his own time because there are French connections there. So I told you England and France hate each other. They also intermarried and interbred a lot in the royal families because they were both constantly trying to take over the other. So they're either at war or they're marrying into each other's families. So Richard of Bordeaux, I hope you know that Bordeaux is French. So keep in mind there's going to be some French connections here. Richard was a child king. Now, we don't often have child kings in England, but he was given the crown at 10 years old. He got it from his father, who, if in the version of Edward the Black Prince's life, I'm casting Arnold Schwarzenegger, not current Arnold Schwarzenegger, glorious vintage 80s Arnold Schwarzenegger. So Richard's father was Edward the Black Prince. First of all, tremendous name. Second of all, Edward the Black Prince was your man's man conqueror of nations. He was a big-time soldier. He was described as incredibly big, strong, tall, courageous, not exactly warm and fuzzy. He wasn't the original king either. Edward the Black Prince was the second son. His older brother died and left him the throne. So, he wasn't exactly raised with all the manners of kingship in mind. He was generally well liked, but he was really a militant man. And he dies, obviously, as a result of some of this behavior, when Richard's 10. Now, Richard was the polar opposite of his father. Richard was frequently described as very small, thin, they would say scholarly, but not in a complimentary way. And we don't get the impression that Richard is highly intelligent, despite the fact that he's highly educated. I mean, he has all the best tutors, he knows all the different things, but the way the information is presented to him does not give him this very realistic sense of education. He was very bad at weapon training. He was incredibly spoiled. And because he was a child, people kind of had a general thought process, which was, kids are easy enough to trick. Let me get on this kid's good side. Like, how do you get on a 10-year-old's good side? Well, you tell them nice things, you compliment them, and you hope they like you. In general, Richard was incredibly, incredibly spoiled. It's the single greatest word to describe him. One of my favorite stories about Richard is that dice was a popular game in the medieval times. And you have to remember, these histories are even older than Shakespeare's time. These are medieval. So you're talking 12 and 1300s here. Dice was a popular game, and Richard had his own set of dice, as many people would have. You know, if you were poor, you probably had dice that were carved out of wood that you made yourself. If you were rich, you had them made out of bone or ivory. Richard had a set of dice that was loaded, so that every time he rolled, he won. That is the greatest metaphor for his life. Every time he rolls the dice, he wins. He never has to face consequence. He never has to face defeat. He never has to wonder about what's going to happen if something goes against what he wants, because he doesn't have the perspective, the world perspective as a 10-year-old and a 12-year-old and a 14-year-old, to surround himself by people who are going to make his ruling easier for him, which means they're going to challenge you, they're going to give you alternatives, they're going to push you when you need to be pushed, like people who build you, really. He doesn't surround himself with them. He only surrounds himself around people who flatter him. And you met them, Bushy and Green, you know. He only surrounds himself with his friends. And you guys know this from doing group work. Sometimes if I say, you have a very big project coming up, you have to choose your own group. Your first instinct might be to go to your friend, but then you might be like, it's not I shouldn't do that, because they're not going to do their share. Like, I know my friends, we're going to goof around, work's not going to get done. Sometimes it's much better to be around people who aren't exactly your bosom buddies while doing this. Now, Richard's cousin was Henry Bolingbroke. He's Henry Bolingbroke now. He becomes Henry IV. He is the cousin of Richard because his father, Henry Bolingbroke's father, is the younger brother of Edward the Black Prince. So you'll meet the last surviving brother of Edward the Black Prince, John of Gaunt. They all have really cool names. If only we still did this, right? So Henry Bolingbroke's a lot more like Edward the Black Prince. He's militaristic. He's really charismatic. People know him. They like him. They generally like him more than Richard. Richard's not well liked because he wants what he wants for himself. He's also really convinced of divine right's kingship. I'm sure your history classes have covered divine right's kingship in the past, but it's important for me to at least establish what it is. It means that the given ruler of a country has been chosen by God. Richard believes that God put him on the throne of England and only God will take him off. So whether he's a good king, whether he's a bad king, it's God's decision. It's not men's decision. So what does he care if people don't like him? What does he care if he raises taxes so much that people can't pay them? That's, it's on God to take him off the throne, not on people. He didn't spend any time trying to figure out how to be a good king for his own people. Richard wasted a lot of money having war with Ireland. He kept raising taxes because he didn't want his lifestyle to change much. And he was constantly throwing money into these foreign wars, which were sort of petty. Like the people weren't really behind them. You know, the Irish are a little too close for comfort. If you had something that was more of a uniting factor, like we're going to go fight the French, England could have gotten behind you. But Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and England are all owned under the same banner, and they just fight a lot. It's sort of like if we were fighting with, I don't know, California. It's like it would get old after a while to keep having an argument with California. Like, we get it, we're not the same, we don't agree. But it's going to get old fighting them. Henry Bolingbroke also believed in divine right's kingship, but he was more practical than Richard. He believed that you could overthrow kings, which will come up. So, Richard, a series of bad choices are made that really make him desperately unpopular to people. So then the only thing you have going for you if your entire ruling populace hates you is you better hope that your people of your court like you. Because if your own court doesn't like you, who is keeping you safe? Your military is going to follow you, but really their own military leader. Your courtiers are going to follow whoever is the best choice for them. He's just ineffective in a lot of ways. He's bored with the more serious aspects of kingship. He doesn't pay attention to them. And then by the time he does, it's kind of too late. This was a pinnacle moment. I'm on slide 8 now. A pinnacle moment that you don't see on screen during Richard II, but you hear the effects of, is Thomas Mowbray helping Richard assassinate the Earl of Gloucester. So Richard got really mad at his friend, the Earl of Gloucester. And Thomas Mowbray was his good friend. So essentially what happened is Richard said to Thomas sort of conspicuously, "Wouldn't it be a shame if something terrible happened to the Earl of Gloucester?" Thomas Mowbray invites the Earl of Gloucester over to his house, and then, oops, the guy's accidentally killed in Thomas Mowbray's house. Accidentally. Everybody kind of knows what happened. It's an open secret. Mowbray then gets ridiculously rewarded. Like as soon as the Earl of Gloucester's dead, suddenly a bunch of money comes Mowbray's way. And everybody's like, oh yeah, I mean, this was a clearly orchestrated hit. Mowbray and Henry Bolingbroke hate each other because there's only really room for one best friend in Richard's life because he has a short attention span. So Henry Bolingbroke wants to be the number one, but right now it's Thomas Mowbray. So he's got to knock Mowbray off that pedestal if he wants to feel safe. You also never quite feel safe if you are blood in line for the throne. If you are in line for the throne, you're always a little on edge because you're a danger to whoever's on the throne. So Henry Bolingbroke is a danger to Richard. He knows this. He's not aware of how much Richard knows this or will act on it, but he knows that's how it works. So in a weird way, I mean, think about the current situation in England. Queen Elizabeth has 4 children. And for her entire life, having children, she knew she would become queen, right? So when she had her firstborn, Charles, she knew she would be queen and he would be king after her. So when you have your son and you know that they're going to take the throne, you're staring at your own mortality. You're staring at your replacement. It's a really weird way to think about life, but practical for them, right? So Richard should be kind of thinking this way, and he just kind of tunes in and tunes out. But Henry Bolingbroke's like, I have a bit of a mark on my back here, and I better be careful. I better stay on Richard's good side, because Bolingbroke would be next in line. Richard doesn't have any children. Anyway, Bolingbroke and Mowbray start to fight. And Bolingbroke calls out that Mowbray assassinated the Earl of Gloucester. So they go to duel. Now, when they duel, and this scene is done exceptionally well in The Hollow Crown, And when you read it, I don't know how you talked about it or whether or not you pointed it out. Dueling was this real over the top preparation. Everyone comes to see it. Like, Richard allowed all the fanfare of the duel to build up. And then as the two of them go to duel, he walks in between them and he throws down the scepter, and everything stops because the king has thrown down his scepter. So there's a huge drama queen aspect to Richard here. Like, Richard wants the attention back on him instead of on them. And when he decides to break up the duel, he punishes them both. He exiles Mowbray for life, and he exiles Bolingbroke for 10 years. And he just takes all of their lands and inheritances. Now, this comes at a time when he's been taxing the hell out of people. So he's just gaining money and gaining money and gaining money. This was a terrible decision on Richard's part. One, you shouldn't exile people because there is not exactly a gate with a key around England. So you have to trust them to stay exiled and not sneak back in. Bolingbroke sneaks back in. Also, why 10 years for Bolingbroke? When he takes all of their money, he also makes a big demonstration to the other people of his court that none of their lands are safe, that he can at any time take their land away from them if it pleases him. Now, I said that the people don't like him, and that's one dash against him. Now the people of the court are starting to go like I don't trust this guy. He could easily, take everything away from us that we've worked for. In particular, the taking of the lands broke down like this. If Richard had given Henry Bolingbroke something, like if he gave him a farm, people didn't see it as the ultimate wrongdoing that he took back that farm because Richard gave it to Bolingbroke. So it's like taking back a gift you gave somebody. It's a little tacky, but you would let it go. The thing that really upset them was that Richard took family inherited property from Henry. So Henry's father dies and leaves him the earlship that their family had. And Richard takes it and all the lands and all the money associated with it. So then everybody is like panicked because they're like, is he going to do that to my kids? That's all many of these families have, is this inherited wealth that goes down the line. So they're very, very nervous that Richard intends to kind of use all of them like this. And Richard doesn't see this because he is so, so bad at reading people and so, so bad at understanding how other people see the world. He's so selfish. His worldview is so narrow. In many ways, he's like a child. And he just doesn't get out of his own way. When this happens, it's pretty much the turning point for Richard, and he just doesn't know it yet. So Bolingbroke is exiled, but then a bunch of people go and find him and basically say, come back to England. We're going to put you on the throne of England. You deserve to be here. Richard the whole time is like, I'm not really worried about Bolingbroke and any of this uprising. Divine rights, kingship, God's going to keep me on the throne of England. And also, I'm too busy with the Irish wars. This is incredibly silly. He really doesn't know when to focus on the right task. So I'm on slide 9 if you're following along. He also, this comes up later, but later in the Henry V play, which you didn't get to, he also uses a different heir after he exiles Bolingbroke. So Bolingbroke should have been next in line, but he chooses a different cousin. So later it's going to come up that there's another potential heir to the throne. And that's going to come back and haunt Bolingbroke. So much fun. Richard goes to Ireland, thinks that he's going with his army. Really, just his most loyal people are supposed to come, or wind up coming. Everyone else stays behind. He finds out that Henry Bolingbroke has taken over his castles, captured his people, killed a lot of his flatterers like Bushy and Green and all that, and basically taken over. and there was almost no resistance. Richard's own forces did not resist Henry Bolingbroke. And when Richard hears this, he's like, I have no choice. I have to give up the crown. Now, in history, this gets really iffy. One, historically speaking, there's no reason to assume that Richard was murdered, but there's a suspicion that he was. We know that he goes to prison with Henry Bolingbroke, and then he died. Some people say this was clearly an assassination. Some people say it was suicide. Some people say, Richard apparently started starving himself in protest. They do a really fun job in the BBC version of showing you how skinny Ben Whishaw is playing Richard. He looks just emaciated by the end of it. There's also kind of a cool element in that movie where it toys with the idea that Richard is gay. I heard that some of you have picked up on this. I have some other kind of versions for you to look at, but Richard tends to be portrayed by someone who's thin, has long flowing hair, very feminine features, higher pitched voice, and the relationship between Bushy and Green is meant to be something of a question mark. In the play you read, Richard has a wife who's older. In history, she's a lot younger. In fact, they never really meet. So Richard's wife was of the ruling family of France, which the British hate. The British just hate the French. So if they don't like you as a king and you're marrying French royalty, they don't like you. She was also like 6 years old when they got married. Now, there was no expectation that they were consummating this marriage when she's 6 years old. You would have gotten married and then waited it out. So don't go to any weird places in your minds. But the idea is also, if you're an unpopular king and you're looking around, you're like, these people don't like me. And you're looking around, my own court doesn't like me. Wouldn't you think it's a bad idea to marry a woman that you can't conceivably have children with for like a minimum of 6 to 8 years? Like, you have to wait, say, 8 years to have a child and secure your line. It's another example of just how bad Richard is at figuring out how to do this kingship thing properly. And I don't know about you, I love hearing him whine and complain because he does it really well. He's one of the people whose whining and complaining doesn't annoy you, but he does get in his own way an awful lot. So the rest of the PowerPoint then goes on to talk about Henry IV and V. If we were doing things a little differently, or at least slides 10, 11, and 12 are going through Richard IV and V, because I do have some things to talk to you about with Richard II. I would have paired Richard II with Henry V so that you would have seen the beginning and end of the series, and I would have just told you a lot about Henry IV in the middle. But I hear you paired it with Macbeth. There's some interesting stuff going on here. Both Macbeth and Richard are kind of bad rulers. They don't understand how to make good decisions. On Macbeth's side, it's interesting because he was a good soldier, we think, right? We get the impression he was good anyway. But he seems to not be able to carry it through as a king. Then you start wondering whether or not his friend was actually the good soldier all along and Macbeth got all the glory when his friend did all the planning. We've all been there. We've all been in the project where our friend got all the credit, but we did all the work. And you start to wonder whether Macbeth is like that. Now, if you go to the 13th slide, you'll start seeing more breakdowns on Richard II, the play. So I have pictures of Ben Whishaw as Richard, and on slide 14, I have David Tennant, who some of you may know as famously, he played Doctor Who. He's been in a bunch of movies, Harry Potter, he's on a bunch of BBC series. He also did what I am told is an amazing Richard II, and I never got to see it. It was in London right before I went to London. I didn't get to see it. There's an implication in Richard II that Richard's too into himself. There's a vanity to Richard. There's a femininity to Richard, potentially a gayness to Richard, that distracts him from becoming the king he needs to be. He is always cast around the same age as Bolingbroke. They were actually different ages, but he is always cast fairly young. It makes sense because you're trying to demonstrate that he was a young enough king. He was a boy king. I mean, he's definitely one of the younger ones. He's also extremely eloquent. Richard's speeches are among my most favorite things that come out of Shakespeare. They're just beautiful. They're pointless because they're whiny, they're self-indulgent, but God, they're beautiful. I have on slide 15 him doing the "Let us talk of graves and worms and epitaph" speech from The Hollow Crown. I really want you to watch it. I also want you to see the scene where he hands his crown to Bolingbroke and his death sequence. The movie clearly takes the stand that Bolingbroke has Richard killed. And I just want you to know that historically it might not be accurate, but the scene of him fighting to give the crown over, because he's physically weaker, he's physically smaller, and the fact that he finds a way to resist, where he's like, here, cousin, here's the crown, come take it. It's just a moment of rebellion that you don't expect him to have. Too little, too late. Like he gets a pair on him far too late in the game. He's struggling against Bolingbroke when it's pointless to struggle. But you're kind of proud of him for doing it. It's kind of beautiful to hear him give this elaborate, like, screw you, man. We all know what you did here. You came in, you pushed me out, and you took over, and now you're asking me to give you my crown. Like I approved this. It's a glorious moment. And as the actors pointed out in an interview I saw, they filmed it in the location that they think that the actual handing over of the crown happened. So it was this tiny little medieval church. It's beautiful. And if you see, Rory Kinnear is young Henry Bolingbroke, and he is aged into Jeremy Irons for Henry IV, which I think is really good casting. It distinguishes them, it gives them each their own space, but the two of them kind of look very hardy next to each other. Now, you guys don't need to look at the Henry IV stuff. You're welcome to if you want to see sort of the evolution. The idea is that if you're a king who gains your crown because you killed the previous king, you have set an unfortunate precedent where it's okay to kill a king and put a different one on the throne, as opposed to like Richard's approach, which is kingship is divine and therefore we don't touch it. You just deal with what you get. God put this on the throne, it's beyond you to fix it. Bolingbroke's way of dealing with things suggests that we can choose our king and therefore kill the one we don't like. So of course Bolingbroke begins to deal with the fact that people who don't like him begin to consider killing him and taking him off the throne. His son is a young drunkard who's not looking like he's going to be a particularly good heir, and then all of a sudden becomes the greatest leader in English history. There's some pretty cool things that happen in Henry V. Now, in terms of Richard II next to Macbeth, I think you should consider, because I am going to eventually have a seminar on this, you should have an idea to look at what makes somebody bad at ruling. What are the pitfalls? What should they have seen and not done? What should they have noticed? You should also have a look for wives. Richard's wife is pointless. She is useless. She's at least portrayed as a decent age, but she doesn't contribute anything. Whereas Lady Macbeth drives the car a lot. Like, Lady Macbeth's always the pusher. Maybe she pushes in bad directions and we don't know how to have a dialogue about how to use the particular set of skills we have. But in general, we at least see a partnership that is much more active than we're used to seeing out of couples from this era. Now, Macbeth is a James era play, not an Elizabeth era play, so it comes significantly after Richard. And it's used to complement James I, because Macbeth, well, not Macbeth, all hail Macduff. you will get kings, but not be one. So Macduff's line is the line that James comes from. So just like how Richard is like Elizabeth's distant descendants, Macduff and the play Macbeth are all about James's distant descendants. Now, I'm going to tell you a little bit about Macbeth. It's usually everyone's favorite. I love Macbeth. James the First was super into demonology, superstitious things, magic, all that. He actually wrote his own book on demonology, and he was a huge collector of books on demonology. This is a fun fact for you. In fact, if we had real yearbooks, what I usually do is offer to write a sincere wish or a funny fact, and this is one of the fun facts I can offer. There's a king of England who had his own demonology book. James the First is the son of Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary, Queen of Scots was killed by Elizabeth for trying to take over the throne of England. And yet Elizabeth maintained James as her heir apparent for years and years and years. God knows how this didn't become complicated or aggressive. But Mary, Queen of Scots was removed from James when he was so young she hardly ever saw him, so he just might not have felt any kind of personal attachment to her at all. It's incredibly interesting that Shakespeare is able to make the shift from being Elizabeth's favorite playwright to being James's favorite playwright. In fact, he's so popular with James that he becomes known as the King's Man, and his company, the King's Men. So that means that the king pays for you to do all your performances. He pays for your costumes and everything. That's a real honor. It's really stinking hard to jump from one monarch to another. Think about it practically. If I'm the queen, I'm going to put my people around me. When I go and say, one of you gets to be the next king or queen, are you going to sit there surrounded by my friends? Or are you going to get rid of my friends and bring your own? You're going to get rid of my friends and bring your own. It was hard for anybody associated with a previous ruler to get in good with a new one. So it's a real testament to Shakespeare's skill. He's highly adaptable too. Suddenly the things he's writing shift and change to match James's interests. When we see the Shakespeare plays after James, they involve a lot more magic. They involve a lot more otherworldliness. It's okay, Killy. They are just things that James wants to see a lot more. And Macbeth was popular among those things. You want to look for things like fatalism. Do we truly command our own fates or not? How do you see the witches? There's a couple different versions of the witches. I've seen Macbeth done in many different ways. I've actually seen Macbeth done in true form where it looks like medieval Scotland. I've seen it just done in monologues. I've seen drunk Shakespeare with Macbeth. That was entertaining. One of the things about the witches is they can be a real deciding factor on how we see things. So sometimes they look super otherworldly and super ghostly, and they're clearly this otherworldly element. Other times, like Macbeth will just be in a crowd and say normal looking people will turn around and do the witch's part. So it's like the witches are always there, but they're normal people. There was one really great version. Actually, I didn't like it at first, and then I rewatched it with students last year, and they loved it so much that they made me love it. But it's Marion Cotillard plays Lady Macbeth, and Magneto plays Macbeth. So the play opens in silence with them burying a child. We get the impression it's a little girl, but we see them burying a child. And then the witches are the three witches, one of them carrying a baby, and then a silent toddler with them. Now, the thing about adapting Shakespeare is Shakespeare did not leave anything in the way of direction, stage direction. So in modern plays, you sometimes get a paragraph of how the stage should look, how the costumes should look, what the actors should do. Shakespeare did not do this because he literally lived with his play troupe. So he would just kind of tell them, you go there, you do this. At best, what you get from Shakespeare is enter scene, exit scene. and you know who's speaking. So the trick with Shakespeare is if you do not see it and you do not hear it, it might actually not be there. Or the opposite's also true. So can Lady Macbeth and Macbeth have a child if we never see it or hear mention of it? Yeah, as long as it doesn't talk. As long as their child never speaks lines that are not attributed to it in the play, it's fair play. It gives Lady Macbeth a totally different set of behaviors if she has just buried a baby. I have seen them with Lady Macbeth miscarrying in the beginning. I have seen them with Lady Macbeth burying an infant. In that other version, she was burying a toddler. Those are all different kinds of grief. I have also seen versions that make no mention of a child at all. You want to consider things like how Macbeth's mental health unravels. Like I said, you sometimes see versions that really begin leaning on the fact that maybe Macduff and Banquo and all them are actually the better military minds, and Macbeth's sort of been stealing their glory, like he's not actually all that good at it. So you might want to consider that. One of the things we're going to look at is that you're going to have Hayden White and Stephen Greenblatt coming up. They are both new historicists. New historicists have an interesting way of looking sort of back at old material, bringing it forward in time. I'm not going to make you read their whole thing, but I will be doing a lecture on what you're supposed to take away from them to make it a little bit easier for you. In the meantime, there's going to be a Google form about the PowerPoint that I just went over. That is the thing I'm grading. So please make sure it gets done. See all you cool cats and kittens on the other side.